Hi everybody, it's great to see so many people here. I'd like to thank Glenn and Georgia for all their organisation for us to be here. Yeah, Bill and William and I go back quite a way actually like this, but I was just thinking as he was talking that the first time I became aware of digital preservation was back in 1992 when I spent the best part of £2 million on a engineering drawing management system which had 42 gigabytes of storage. And the realization that because it was all stored on basically glass platters, that we actually didn't have any way of backing up our data. We were in a situation where, when I say we had 42 gigabytes of storage, I mean we had 42 gigabytes of storage. We had no backup for that, really, effectively, other than large volumes of tape. And so this has been an issue that's been around for a really long time. And we're all living in this environment, and I'm very grateful for you to come and listen to us all today about this issue. I'm going to talk about values because I think it's an unseen part of the process. I feel that digital preservation is often a bit of a Cinderella service. I think that digital services, in some respects, in many museums, are underappreciated. But underlying all of those conversations, whether you're in a curatorial position or if you're in a management or administrative position, or whether you're in an environment where you are making content decisions, will be issues around values. But what I find is that they're unspoken issues around values. So it's constantly there as part of the conversation, but it's not often actually brought to the surface and discussed in an open way. You know, what are our shared values? What are the things that we're trying to do here as an organization? How are we going to take those forwards? And how do we engage with this in a useful fashion rather than it being just some sort of marketing speak or some phrase which is trotted out every couple of years when you're doing some sort of strategic review? You know, how do we make it part of what we do? And I'm going to be proposing some modes of digital value which I think might help us to focus, might help us to think about how we're going to engage with these issues. And one of the analogies that I use, just to start off with, is sometimes one of the easiest ways of looking at an organization and thinking as a sort of thought experiment, and thinking to yourself, okay, how do I understand where the priorities of this organization are, is to just ask yourself the question, is the value in the wine, the glass, or the drinking? So for that organization, where do they put their value? Where do they spend most of their time, energy, and effort? So if the grapes are your collection, the wine is your digital content, the glass is your infrastructure, the drinking is your access activities, then clearly all of these four things are needed. You can't get anywhere without the others. But where you put your emphasis often tells you a lot about the institution. So if you're the British Library, for instance, Glenn mentioned their maturity in digital preservation, then the wine is incredibly important, as are the grapes, because they have a national remit to be a library of last resort. Collection is there. That doesn't mean that drinking or glasses aren't important to them, but at the end of the day, if they had to make a choice, collections, you know, it's going to be there. If you're Twitter, it's all about drinking. Drink, drink, drink. Don't care about anything else. So somewhere in there, you will find yourself at one end or around there. Now, the thing that, when I've asked this question in other environments, said, what do you think is most important? And you always get this response where people talk about the access and the drinking and the wine, and very few people say the glass. So many of you in this room are the heroes who look after the glass. The heroes who look after the infrastructure, the heroes who make it actually possible for everything else to happen. Because just imagine how messy it's going to be if we don't have a glass and we're all trying to walk around with our wine in our hands like this. It's not going to work out very well, is it? along those lines. So just remember that there's a lot of unsung heroes here in the room. And a lot of people who probably deal with the same situation that I deal with. I just been on holiday, and my 14-year-old son said to me, "What are you doing when you go back to work, Dad?" And I said, "I'm going to give this talk. I'm going to talk about digital preservation." And he looked at me in the eye and he went, "And what do you do again?" And I went, "Yeah, I can't really explain it." And you'll probably, many of you find yourself in that same situation as well. So, we're not necessarily appreciated from any particular direction, but what we do and what you do matters. It does matter, and I want to press that point. So the first half of my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the theory that's behind my thinking around value, and then I'm going to spend the second half talking about modes of digital value for memory institutions and how we can show that in action through an example. I've been working with Europeana on their impact task force and the impact toolkit, and we'll show that as an example as we go towards the end of the presentation. Some of the slides are wordy because I want you to have the information, not because I'm going to say everything that's on the slide. All the slides are available. There should be a tweet very soon which gives you access to my slides on SlideShare, points you to my blog, so they're all already available. And I know that this will be filmed and be available to you later as well. So you don't have to scribble too hard. You can just download that stuff and access it at your leisure. So memory institutions. I've used this phrase, and I've used it deliberately because I wanted to expand beyond the galleries, libraries, archives, museums, GLAM type environment. And I'm using the phrase because I'm assuming a common aspiration across multiple sectors in preserving, organizing, and making available the cultural and intellectual records of their societies. And also to reflect, to a certain extent, the confluence with the growth in digital. So whilst it does include museums, obviously, it might also include other types of organizations. You could imagine the Internet Archive or the BBC fitting into this criteria as well. So I just wanted to put that out there when I talk about memory institutions, what I mean by that. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the unfunded mandate, which is behind a lot of the digital developments that are happening in museums in particular. And what I mean here by unfunded mandates is the idea that you're all sat continuously at this inflection point between the past and the future. You're trying to prepare for the future, an unpredictable future where you're not quite sure what digital collections are going to come your way. You're not altogether certain what an artist is going to come up with next that you're going to have to store. You may be a museum. I was working with some regimental museums who are suddenly finding themselves in a situation where they're getting terabytes of data being sent to them from war zones that they have to preserve in relationship. They're not prepared for that. So we're always, at this point, we're looking into the future. What's the future like? It feels a bit unpredictable at that time. And also what we're trying to do is we're trying to reach into our massive heritage and legacy of collections and pull those into the present so that people have access to these resources. And that might be through things like digitization and those sorts of activities. So we're at this point. And the thing here is that it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this. You could be doing this for 10 years and you're still at this point. It doesn't change. It's a constant now that we're having to reflect upon. I've missed off a few things here. I should mention film and video, obviously. And we talk about virtual heritage, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, all those sorts of areas. There's a big Getty organised meeting going on at King's College London this week on linked open data for museums. So all of these things are going. What I talk about when I mean unfunded mandates is that we're expected to do this on the same or less money, and we're not asked to stop doing something else to enable us to do this. And so this is really one of the challenges that we're facing here is this unfunded mandate. I'm always reminded of the National Library of New Zealand, who a number of years ago, when their government placed a mandate upon them to store in perpetuity all of the deposited digital content for the library. So what some wise and witty staff at the National Library of New Zealand did a number of years ago was they got printed some T-shirts. which just said on them, privately printed, they didn't wear them in the library or anything, it just said, perpetuity is a very long time. And the problem there is that you're being asked and mandated to preserve something in perpetuity on a 3-year funding cycle. So there's some discontinuities here that we're having to address, that we're having to think about. And part of this is about the way that we can conceive of and contemplate our values, how we're going to think about what matters to us in our institutions. So let me go into some concepts around values, knowledge, and museums. And I really like this quote from Roger Smith, who says, "We must look again at the relations between knowledge and values. The criteria according to which we say something is good, beautiful, or true." Now, we just do not have anywhere near enough time to unpack that. So I'm not going to. But that, at essence, is quite a lot of the thematic and theoretical background to what we're engaging with here. We're often asking ourselves the question, is this true? Is this good? Is this beautiful? And that means different things to different people, obviously, in many different circumstances. Richard Sandel also says, museums especially have the power to privilege particular forms of knowledge and to naturalize highly particularized sets of values. And museums are dealing with these sorts of issues on an ongoing basis. You might summarize this as the dead white European male syndrome in terms of the way that collections were built, and then the way that we just look at those 19th century collections and go, oh, they're all out of copyright, we can digitize those and just bring them into this environment now, without any thinking about the fact that all we're doing is just perpetuating that 18th century view of what was important or valuable in the world. So dead white European males. I've hit 3 of those so far, those criteria. I'm hoping that the last one is an aspiration for the long-term future. But it is clearly an issue which we're dealing with. We're going to deal with it when we talk about repatriation. We're going to deal with values when we talk about decolonializing collections. We're going to deal with it when we start to think about our catalogues and the way that we've classified our collections in the past, and who had authority to say what is valuable, what is worthy, what is worth keeping, what is worth being available in a digital environment. And so values are a very current and ongoing thing that we're thinking about when we talk about knowledge and values in museums. And it's tricky in the digital environment because what we see when we look at values is we see that values are individually understood and attributed, but collectively shared and thus magnified. It may well be that there's a lot of people in this room who hold similar values about why we should collect content, why we should make that available for the future. But scratch any individual and you'll find that they have a very individualized set of values which are very specific to them and come from a very personalized environment. And certainly, although we all stood up and said we're all digital creators, we're all digital collectors and curators and managers, at the same time, how we do that, the way we do that is becoming increasingly individualized, becoming very, very personalized. How you spend your time with your data becomes very, very personal. But then as soon as you receive it, you then start sharing it and you start externalizing it. And it is viewed through a social lens with call and response through Twitter, through other social media frameworks, even through technologies that have been around with us for a very long time, like email. And so we have this challenge, which is, how do we reach out with our values, where we try and make those a community-based or a group-based set of values, to a group of people who are all thinking of themselves as individualized accessors to our digital content, but then act in a shared and magnifying way at the same time. So we have this challenge of digital which atomizes content, atomizes our engagement with individual pieces of information and pieces of data, but at the same time aggregates experience in a shared environment. It's quite a challenging thing to contemplate. And values are more than money. And there's a real tension here often between the concept of knowing the price of something and knowing the value of something. And often there's a conflation here with phrases like worth. Is it worth having? Is it worthy of us to contain and hold on to that content? And Dave O'Brien, in his really good book on cultural policy, talks about the word value describing an idea about economics, an idea about personal expression, and an idea about morality. And I think that in some ways you can find roots back to that good, beautiful, true from all of these phrases. So sometimes value is described as an economic marker of worth, or how much a product or service is valued compared to others, always in comparison. Or maybe it's a willingness to pay for something. Sometimes value is an arbiter of preference, satisfaction, aesthetics, or taste at any given moment, remembering that this is fluid. And morality, in our context, may talk about that the value may be viewed on access of moral and ethical debates, such as factors such as security, integrity, authenticity, and validation. And these are all phrases that you will have come across when you're thinking about digital. Do we have authentic data? Can we validate our data? Is our interactions with our communities secure? What is the integrity of our data over the long term? So these values come forward in that context. And there's a particular thing called intangible value that we're trying to deal with here. And I want to focus on that just for a moment before going on to talk about modes of value. So where the value cannot be tangibly touched, such as education or social memory, you can't really touch it, but it's there. It's not recordable as a transaction value. It's not something I can necessarily sell or transact, or indicated by a set of assets, which is why we should be concerned about people who say, I've got 100,000 digital objects, as if that's a sign of their intangible value. It has a large information component. It's very, very fluid, possibly changing in value over time and between different groups, such as beliefs, interests, or symbolic associations. And it's essential for us to appreciate, because if we're memory institutions, we're thinking about our digital resources, we rely on intangible values such as knowledge, social memory, education, brand, or goodwill for the reasons for being. And I've been interviewing various members of staff around the world, and when I talk to people at the State Museum of Art in Denmark, they talk about the physical art pieces are tangible, preserved physically, and they are hanging here, and we can see it and discuss it, but the same mindset needs to be transferred into the digitized version of the art as well, said Christina Jensen. So one of the approaches I took to this was to look at all of the different ways in which value is engaged with and think, are there modes of digital value that we can apply to our digital collections, to our digital resources? And I decided on these 5 modes of digital value. You could add to this. The reason I've used modes is because these are areas where I see these sorts of values most frequently being presented, most frequently being engaged with. This doesn't mean that this is an exclusive list or that you can't add things. So when I've talked to museums, often they'll say, could we add leisure or entertainment to this? I go, yeah, if you want to, if that works for you, if that's important to you, you could do so. So we talk about utility. So this is a very tangible benefit. So I'm glad this is here. It enabled me to do something. This is where your web metrics is going to be showing. We have 1 million users. They are utilizing our web resource. Education. Are we adding to the wealth of knowledge of our communities, whether that's in school or formal education, or whether that's through lifelong learners engaging with us and our museums. Is it about building a community? Do we add to the communities that we are engaged with? Are we enhancing people's sense of community, sense of place, sense of understanding of their heritage or those sorts of issues? But it's also about what I would call bequest, now phrased as inheritance legacy, that long history that is encompassed by most of our museums. And of course, we're here stood in the British Museum, one of the longest encompasses of those, that inheritance and legacy. And often when we talk about digital preservation, we also talk about, well, how much time and effort have we spent over the last 20 years in building digital platforms and building digital content? Maybe that inheritance legacy is starting to become, to have a similar sort of value to the sort of collection legacy that we might be talking about in our museums. And existence prestige. So there are values which exist even if we don't use the thing that we're engaged with. So people might value the existence of the British Museum even if they've never entered the museum itself. They may see it as a symbol of prestige or national pride, or see it as something that is important to exist for other people. Anyone who's ever tried to close down a local museum or a regional library will find all these people jumping up and saying, no, you can't close that down, I think it's important. And you say, well, you've never been to it. Doesn't mean it's not important to them. So existence prestige. My example for this is St. Paul's Cathedral. I walked past it this morning. Do you know what? I've never actually been inside, but I'd be really upset if someone tried to take that away from us. You know, so existence prestige can be issues there. And I've defined these in more detail here for you to read at your leisure along those. And some of these are direct and indirect, or indirect benefits. Some of these are more tangible, more intangible benefits, and present us with a way of maybe focusing our attention. So rather than saying value, and that being this vague, don't know what to do with it word, that's, as I just said, individually understood. So what does that, how can I then have a conversation with you about value? We can talk about breaking it down into smaller groups, and then these may be becoming something we can discuss and work with and think about. Now, one of the things that I'm most pleased is that I'm really, really pleased when my research is then taken on by a community, and then they do something with it and build on it and make it better than I made in the first place. And certainly this is something that's been my experience with working with Europeana. They're building tools for impact assessment around something called the Impact Toolkit. They've done a number of impact assessments. They engaged with my 5 values and sort of made them their own, because everything I do is open access if possible. So I want people to be able to build on stuff. And they recently did their own impact assessment journey for Europeana 1914-18 collections. And I'll use this just to illustrate how those values I was talking about could be applied in a more practical environment, so they don't just sit there as being theoretical ideas. So one of the ideas here is about utility value. So looking at the 1914-18 collections through the utility lens, if you like. So asking questions, how do you rate user experience in a qualitative type way? But also this is where we can start throwing in some of our quantitative numbers in terms of 575,000 online users, you know, those sorts of numbers, to contextualize those qualitative feelings and to help to focus on areas of use. One of the things when we did an assessment using these value lenses with the Wellcome Trust was they realized they didn't have enough metadata to help people navigate their genomics collection. So people were specifically using front page material but not exploring further. And the reason they weren't exploring further was because they didn't have enough metadata. So you can use these as ways of asking questions which then allow you to create a feedback loop which then allows you to improve your services and then obviously the visible value of those things. They also asked the question about community value, and I'm only going to do this for a couple of these, so we're not going to go on about this, but they asked users to rate how much the Europeana 1418 makes them feel connected to other people interested in the First World War. And they were able to show increases in understanding, in people's sense of community, in the awareness of materials around that. They also helped to build some communities where people were coming together at events, and then we're able to say, actually, now we're going to continue being part of this community now that we've met here. We're not going to stop being that. So fostering those sorts of things. This is all stuff that you're already doing, isn't it? I'm really honestly, you know, please don't take from this me suggesting that you don't already do this. But maybe you don't measure or think about it in a faceted way, which allows you then to express those values out to people who are going to be worried about the money question or are going to be worried about the sustainability issue. So I'm hoping that these values are ways of engaging with these ideas such that it helps you to be able to focus. And so we're always going to be balancing strategies. And so when I conceive of strategies, I talk about this in the Balanced Value Impact model. I talk about things like we're going to be having questions about the economics. You know, how sustainable is this? How long-term? How much money do we have to engage with this? Are we improving our financial status or the financial status of our communities through this? Are we improving a social situation? Are we building communities and social benefit? Are we being innovative in this digital space, doing new things that we couldn't do otherwise? Are we being more efficient and effective in our operations, in the way that we operate as an organization? And I think that the idea of having these 5 values provides you with a way of focusing. So anytime you're thinking about balancing these big strategic goals that you've got as an organization, you can use the values as a way of focusing your thinking, well, which of these are we trying to achieve? How are we trying to achieve? How are these expressed for us as an organization? So I've used these 5 values with a couple of museums where they've been thinking about their strategic environment, their digital strategy, and we sat down with senior managers, trustees, executives, and said, rank these 5 values from 1 to 5. That's not to say that 5 is not important, but it means that if you had to put them in order, where would you put them? And it's really interesting that in a lot of occasions when I've done this, trustees will put utility and education in their top 2. And they'll put inheritance as their number 5 thing. And when I do this with the curators in that museum, they'll put education and inheritance in their top 2, and they'll put utility somewhere in 3, 4, around those areas. And that can be a really enlightening conversation, because what you've done there is you've just revealed why you're having this conversation where you feel like you're banging your head against a wall. It's because they don't get it. And it helps to disambiguate some of those conversations to allow you to maybe have a more honest and open conversation about those areas. So that's everything I've got to say about this. What I've hoped to do is just give you some ways of thinking about some of the problems that you're engaging with here today. Hopefully also giving you some things to disagree with and say, no, that's not how it is. It should be different from this. It should be those things. But also to be part of a conversation with you. And hopefully we'll be able to spend some time today together talking about modes of digital value for a memory institution. Thank you very much.